Well, to start with, thank you for Creative Mornings and inviting me along today to talk about money. I'm a big fan of money, so I'm very happy to talk about it. Just to fill out some of that background about me, I have been working in the creative fields for about 10 years. Before that, I was working in the construction industry, so I've got a bit of a varied background. During that whole time, I've really enjoyed my relationship with money. I enjoy having it, I enjoy spending it. I've been lucky enough to work with organizations that require it and have been able to source it. So I started off in the publishing sector, barely publishing. It was more performance scripts for small theatre companies in Queensland, but it was a first foray into the arts, moving from construction. From there, I don't know how, but I got a job running a not-for-profit in Queensland with approximately 2,000 members, running a range of programs to help young artists, designers, craft practitioners, artisans have career opportunities, define career paths, professionally develop, and all the mechanisms behind that. So exhibitions, publishing, professional development workshops, industry location, all those kind of things. I was well and truly out of my depth. I'd come from a small not-for-profit where I was the business manager, so I was good at managing money, but then I went into an organization where I was actually running it, and that was a whole different thing. I had to learn on the job, I had to learn quickly. Working with bureaucracy was kind of tricky, but we managed to do some great things. We started the Art Biennale, which was art, craft and design biennial in Brisbane. I don't think it's still running now, but I did two, and I think there was another one or two after I left. And then from there I came down to Sydney to run a commercial gallery called Grant Peary. It no longer exists either. Maybe I'm the angel of death for organisations. But we did some great things. We kind of turned the commercial sector on its head in terms of contemporary art and looked at the non-commercial aspects and how they fit into the commercial. And I think that's kind of, it was a big learning experience for me in terms of how you actually market and sell contemporary art. Because, I'm of the belief, and I'll get to this a bit later, that you can't actually do that. There is no way to sell contemporary art in the traditional sense. The way you engage is coming around the back and kind of appealing to other people's ideas of what art should be, what it can be, their engagement, narratives, all those kind of things. From there, when the gallery closed, I decided to take a sabbatical. I took a year off, I travelled, I had a bit of fun, I lived in Africa for a while, I bounced around, and then I came back to Art Bank in October last year. So I'm relatively fresh back to Australia, and I'm quite enjoying my time at Art Bank and the job that I've been given. It's quite a challenge, but also quite a responsibility. How do I make this PDF start working? So Art Bank, it's a government support agency that was started back in the 80s. Will that go by itself? Government support agency started back in the 80s. It was a concept of the Fraser government, and it was brought into realisation in 1980. So we're 33 years old, and we have a dual charter. The first half of our charter looks at supporting contemporary art. It actually says encourage contemporary visual artists through the acquisition of their work. So we like to encourage. And then the other part of the charter is to promote the value of contemporary art to the public and private sectors. So when I came to Art Bank, we were doing leasing, and that's part of the promotion, and we were doing that quite well. We have nearly 10,000 works in our collection. We're actively buying, we're increasing our market share, we're increasing our collection, and we're continually evolving the organisation. But the one thing I didn't think that we were doing is actually looking at the promotion side of what we do in a holistic way. And coupled with that, how we can use our support role to leverage one off the other. Before I get into that, I'll just, I put a lot of thought into what the PDF or the presentation might be to go along with my talk. So what I've done, I've selected a number of artworks from our collection. They're artworks from a variety of artists. Some names you'll know, some names you won't. But the interesting thing in terms of how the presentation is orientated, it works from our cheapest work in our collection in terms of value to our most expensive. So it's an interesting kind of cross-section of the collection over a number of years. And it really does go back 33 years. In the bottom corner, you can see the price of the work, if everyone can see that. So, Art Bank, it's a vehicle. Actually, before I start that, let me put a little disclaimer in. I'm new to the public service, and I consider it to be quite a responsibility. So I want to put a little disclaimer in that these are my views, not the views of the Commonwealth, of the federal government. We're in an election year. I don't want to get myself into any trouble. So these are my views, and even if I say something controversial, please don't retweet it to Julia Gillard. I know she'll be interested to hear it. I think Art Bank sits in a broader conversation around contemporary art in Australia. Contemporary art in Australia is an interesting beast in that it is quite an inward-looking market in terms of the commercial side, but we have a group of artists which are always looking externally. Australian contemporary art, for those that don't know, can arguably be built on a history of appropriation. So looking to what happens elsewhere and kind of reinterpreting that through an Antipodean or an upside-down Australian gaze. Obviously, we're built on Indigenous culture, a multicultural group of artists and community that is constantly shifting and changing what the visual landscape is in Australia. What that has done for the market is actually made it a self-sustaining market. You can have a practice in Australia without ever showing overseas. You can actually break that down to have a practice in Brisbane, which is economically viable and supports you, without ever having a show in Sydney or Melbourne. What we see at play is quite a segmented country in a lot of ways. There are artists that have breakthrough. Ben Quilty's show up at NAS is a good example of that artists that cross geographical and conceptual boundaries. But fundamentally, there's a high level of parochialism within Australian contemporary art, and that is played out. So, you'll see that in going to an exhibition in Sydney of a Melbourne artist, where there'll be a handful of people. But if you have it go next door and there's a Sydney artist showing, it'll be packed. That is kind of playing out something that's happening on a larger scale internationally. I mean, things are starting to change. The internet has closed the gap between the time it takes for information to reach Australia. Back in the early 1950s, 1920s, even earlier, magazines arrived by ship. They didn't arrive by plane. So there was a good month to 6 to 8 weeks before you actually saw what was going on in contemporary art in Europe. So you were actually always behind what was happening. Interestingly, I think that has created something unique in an international context. And I think there are a lot of opportunities for the design, visual art practitioners, artisans in Australia to kind of leverage off that when they're moving internationally. But today I've been asked to talk about money, and obviously my experience is to do with contemporary art. I never planned on working in the commercial world. I have a strong belief in supporting artists. I started my visual arts career working in a support agency. But what I quickly learnt is that the role of money, whether you're working in a not-for-profit or you're working in a commercial endeavour, is exactly the same. It's just how you go about getting it that's different. Working in the not-for-profit world, you're actually applying for funding. You're going to the government, you're going to foundations, corporations, a range of individuals maybe, if you're lucky enough, and asking for money. The commercial world is just a little bit more direct in that you're selling something. You're actually having a transaction. It's a transactional economy that you're leveraging off. But the fundamentals are the same. What you end up with is funding to continue what you're doing. Now, whether that's an organisation or whether for a commercial gallery, let's say, you're putting money straight back into artists' pockets. So you're representing artists. You're creating real opportunities. And a good gallery creates good opportunities by not only selling work, but being able to talk about that work, being able to create connections between various communities, to bring people in, to connect them with stories. And when I was working in the commercial gallery, my approach was to actually connect people with the ideas, the concepts within the work, rather than trying to sell them that work. Through that intimacy that's created, that familiarity, I think you have a greater chance of people wanting to take that home, to continue that relationship in a private context, whatever that may be. And for whatever reason that is. I mean, it might just be to show off to their friends, to go, hey, look at me, I'm ahead of what's going on, and look how cool I am. But more often than not, it's about a connection, something that you feel within that work, something that speaks to you. And often it'll speak to you but not your partner. It'll speak to you but not your friends. So it is a very personal, intimate relationship that you build with contemporary art. The relationship between art and money is something that's long-standing. Artists have required benefaction from day dot. Well, maybe not day dot. But from the Renaissance forward, let's say, benefactors, whoever they may be, private individuals, the church played a massive role in commissioning contemporary art. A lot of what we have now wouldn't be around if it wasn't for religion and its representation of iconology. So I don't think that we should ever shy away from it. In a contemporary context, I think visual art, as with most art forms, are a representation of the broader community, the cultural context that they're operating within. So I like to break it up. If you look at collective cultural consciousness and individual consciousness, cultural consciousness, you can see similar things playing out. So the collective have an understanding of what something means in terms of visual language, but an individual takes that, filters it, mediates it through their gaze, all their experiences, and then comes out with something maybe totally different. I like to relate it to someone who's colorblind. You have two people standing in a room, one who's colorblind, one who's not. They see the same thing but in a totally different way. And neither can understand the other's perspective because neither can actually, put themselves in the other person's shoes. So I think that's important to understand. A lot of people believe that a relationship or a close relationship between money and art diminishes the art. I don't think it does. I think it actually places it within an economy that most people can understand. We all rely on money. It's one of the fundamental needs that we have these days. We've moved away from food, shelter, water, all those kind of hierarchy of needs that we had when we were less evolved, let's say. And money has kind of replaced some of those. Without money, we can't afford shelter. We can't afford food. We can't buy the clothes that we need or want, more importantly. So these things are connected. So we shouldn't shy away from them. We should look at them. We should shine the light on them. A lot of artists are doing this. Internationally, artists like Damien Hirst are looking at the commodification of art very literally through the way that he makes his work, through the way that he sells his work. I think he's making a joke. A lot of people don't think that because collectors want to be on the bandwagon. They want to be buying things. They want to be, on the next thing. But the way that it's happening, it has to be a joke. I'm sure he's waiting for everyone to wake up and realize what's going on and, kind of understand that his work isn't worth the money that people are paying for it. They're just paying it for who knows what reason, and he's getting rich off it. So, who really cares? If they can afford to buy it, why not? And this leads me on to my next point about the relationship between value and worth. This is something that's often misunderstood, especially, I don't mean to be condescending, but especially by artists. The pricing of artwork is a very loaded, very complex discussion to have with an artist. And then once that decision has been made, to articulate that into your broader community of supporters, whether they're collectors or curators or institutions, it's very difficult to kind of find the right balance. So a lot of artists will go, especially emerging artists, will say, well, I spent this much money making this work, I want this much return. I mean, I wish it was retail. I mean, you buy a jacket from a shop, it's got at least 100% markup on it. But contemporary art doesn't work like that. The investment that you make in time, in materials, is something very different to, what happens in a garment factory in China or Portugal. You're making that investment for a different set of reasons. And I think those reasons are the interesting thing that artists have to kind of listened to. They're not doing it to get rich. Even though now I think there is a little bit of a celebrity happening around contemporary artists that hasn't been around for arguably since Brett Whiteley. That people want to be an artist now, to have celebrity, to kind of be rich. They see younger artists who are mid to late 30s having very successful careers. They're on TV all the time. They're driving nice cars. They have 3 houses. I know an artist that drives a Porsche. I mean, I don't drive a Porsche. But what we have to do is understand the relationship between worth and value. So just because you pay $1,000 for something doesn't mean it's worth that. It could be worth $5,000, literally, in terms of the cost of the material that went into it. It could be worth 10. Ultimately, it's probably invaluable to the artist who made it. But we need to kind of interrogate the relationship between worth and value, not just in contemporary art, but in a broader context as well. And I think we lose that. Real estate in Sydney is a great example. You look at a terrace over there, you're probably looking at about, conservatively, $20,000 to $30,000 worth of raw material. But you try and buy that terrace, you're looking at $700,000, $800,000, $900,000. There's not that much labour in it. And if that terrace is 100 years old, that labour was probably, let's say $100, to be generous. And that's depreciated over the last 100 years. So what's it really worth? And these conversations can be taken back to the creative sphere. I work with a variety of creative professionals, from filmmakers to designers, to artists, to writers, to performers, to directors of theatre companies. I mean, I've worked and currently work with a varying group of people, and they have the ones that are successful have a sophisticated understanding of that. I spent a lot of time consternating on this issue, and more importantly, the relationship of contemporary art to contemporary society. I think that over, let's say in modern history, art has removed itself, contemporary art has removed itself largely in terms of relevance to contemporary society. I think that might have been a response to an increasing commodification of contemporary art by artists, either consciously or subconsciously, but however it worked out, it worked out. When was the last time that you actually watched the news and an artist was being interviewed or an artwork was being created to respond to a particular issue? I mean, I may have seen it once or twice in my career. Fundamentally, artists have no real voice outside of their commercial context now. Institutionally, they have a voice. Curatorially, they have a voice. Outside of that, their commercial context is probably the thing that has the most resonance. You sell for a lot of money, that's what you get covered on. You make work that is controversial, you get coverage on that. But the relevance, the day-to-day relevance of visual art is kind of minor. And I kind of despaired about that. I left a really well-paying job to come into the arts thinking that I was going to contribute to society in an interesting and meaningful way, and there was none of this happening. And to be really frank, I considered leaving the industry. I thought, well, if this isn't going to happen, I might as well go and do something else. But once I gave it a bit more thought, this postmodern construct of visual art sitting separate to contemporary society is actually just a stage we're at. It's a reflection of society that we're in now, where we have an individualism promoted through our own existence, rearticulated, supported through various forms of media. So why should contemporary art be any different? Why should visual artists be doing something different to that? They are just members of our community. They're reflecting what's happening. But that irrelevance that has sprung up is their relevance. They're a mirror of contemporary society. Whether the work they're making mirrors what's going on, or whether their disconnect, their absence from contemporary society is what their relevance is, I think it still has meaning. And I think this ties into the idea of value being a retrospective construct. I think in 100 years we'll look back on this time and we'll be able to identify these trends, these moments in time, as movements. I don't know what you'd call it. Maybe it's the irrelevant movement. It's not quite as catchy as the postmodernist or the surrealist movement, impressionist movement, but I think it still has its place. And value in all forms is retrospective. We don't make something going, okay, I'm going to make something that's going to be worth $1,000. No one does that, no matter what you're doing. You make something that you want to make, and then a value is placed on it. So in that very direct relationship with pricing structures, value is retrospective. But importantly, as we move through history, we can see many moments in time where things that have had no real value have been revalued and have become extremely valuable, which is part of the reason I've orientated this slideshow as I have. It's not historical. Some of the most valuable things aren't the oldest. In this case, they probably are. But that's just purely based on money. It's not based on what their contribution is. I think kind of to summarize, to wrap up, what we need to be focusing on for the future is reinforcing these narratives. Part of what we're doing at ArtBank, and as a player within the cultural community, not a major player, just a player, a contributor, is to look at how we can reinforce these narratives and promote them as being the real worth within contemporary art. Because that is where the worth lies. From the moment, the story that goes into the work that's made, through it to it being exhibited for the first time, the relationships it has with the people that view it, and the relevance that has not only to the artist and to the work and the context that it overlays, but to the people who do view it. To that work leaving the gallery, going on exhibition, going on tour, going to someone's house, to being a conversation point at dinner parties. These narratives form part of that work's history. They form part of the story. In contemporary art we call it provenance, loosely, in terms of the journey that an artwork has. But everything that informs that journey, everything that is bookended by that journey, is the important, the valuable things. They're the things that we're going to remember. Not how much the painting sold for, not what type of cars the artist drove, but we're going to think about that relationship we had to it. I've done projects where I've put artworks in the back of trucks and driven it around town. I've done sound performances off the top of on rooftops on the buildings that I worked in, to look at the way sound, the ephemeral nature of sound and performance related to people's literal experience of the built environment and that very rigid kind of construct, historical construct. I think that there's capacity not just for ArtBank, but for everyone to kind of contribute to that. And that's what I want to be part of, and that's what I think ArtBank can do for the community. So, thank you. Any questions? This is the most expensive work we have, by the way. No questions?
Do you think the government is sort of helping visual artists these days?
Do I think the government is helping visual artists? Wow. I think Australia is unique in a lot of ways in terms of the relationship between government and creatives. We have a culture of grant making, which I think is both positive and negative. I think it can create, I'll use a term, dual speed economy within the creative industries, where a lot of artists won't self-orientate if they don't get a grant. Whereas I think you look at what's happening overseas, a lot of artists don't rely on grants, so they think of other ways to creatively engage other people, to bring in sponsors, partners, and they'll make things happen. So I think the government does support. I think it does a really good job of supporting a variety of art forms and puts more money in than most countries do. I think ArtBank is a visionary example of government policy in that we're self-sustaining. We don't get any money from consolidated revenue. We generate our own revenue through the leasing of work. We get a little bit of in-kind support, and we're still formally part of the department, but it is perpetual. We generate enough money to cover our acquisitions, to cover our operating costs, and to kind of do interesting things that support artists in a different way. I guess if I was making government policy, which I'm not, I would like to see more examples of the art bank model being played out, where we're looking at sustainability not just for artists, but we're looking at sustainability for organisations over the long term. And I think Arts Council UK have done some interesting things looking at 10-year funding agreements, which provide stability and forward planning for organisations to be able to kind of have a strategy to move off government funding. Because there's a carrot and the stick. You get 10 years funding, but that's it. You don't have to apply for funding every year or every 3 years, but at the end, you need to have a business plan that will make you sustainable. And I think the other thing, because we're so young in Australia, that we kind of hold on to too much is everything needs to last forever. It doesn't. Failure is part of success. Without failure, we don't know what success looks like. But we need to actually do what we need to do. And if that costs the organisation, so be it. The organisation closes, something springs up in its place. You do what you need to do in the time that you have. So yes, I do think government supports artists quite well in Australia. Yes.
In the context of what you said, how do you assess the artworks that you buy or that you already have? As in, it's fantastic to see what they're worth, but do you reassess what they're worth over time?
Yeah, the collection's valued every year, independently valued. So we have a current market value of the collection. And we do that for two reasons. Insurance being the basic one, because it's worth a lot. And the other one is our rental rates. So if you want to take this work home, for instance, you can have it in your house for $5,000 a year. That rental rate will never go up. But once you hit 50 grand, the rental rates are fixed. Below that, though, they're tied to market value. So it's a sliding scale, and it's too complex to kind of explain. But yeah, we constantly value. We also have a curatorial department. So accessioning, the works being purchased, are done so through a curatorial gaze. We keep in the back of our mind over here, it's like, well, we want to be able to lease that. But fundamentally, we're looking at best practice, museum quality works, supporting artists over a number of years. And we're moving into commissioning, which is a new thing for us in terms of supporting artists to make work rather than they have to fund it, then we'll buy it. We're looking at a variety of programs that kind of round out what we do. But yeah, it's a constant process. And the way we buy, the way we acquire works, being curatorially focused, is partly because you can't tell what people want. It's that subjective value thing. You know, you could look at this painting and go, wow, it's the most amazing thing I've ever seen, or you can go, wow, that's pencils. You know, I don't care about having pencils at home. But so its value is subjective. The thing that you like is the thing that you like. Doesn't mean that it's the thing that everyone's going to like. So the way we approach it is kind of at arm's length from leasing, but it's somewhere over here. Gemma.
I was just wondering, I guess a lot of the framework around modern art talks about luck and, an artist being in the right place at the right time within the right socioeconomic circumstances to be successful. And just looking at these bottom line figures, there's a lot of variance. Do you think that, focusing on the second half of Art Bank's charter, which is, the narrative around art, is going to have an impact on that bottom line of these artworks, or do you think that it's still going to be a bit of luck involved?
Well, the relationship between luck and success. It's an interesting question. Listen, I think there is a component of luck, if you want to term it like that, in that you're lucky if someone recognizes what you recognize in the work. Because, especially people who are doing interesting things have to bring people along with them. They have to bring people along with the story they're telling. And you look at historically, when that's happened, there's been a lag. The Impressionists were kind of a good example of that in terms of how that worked. People didn't quite get why. Well, if you can paint figuratively, why aren't you? Why are you just putting dots on the canvas? Or why are you doing this? It took a retrospective gaze to kind of understand the value in that. So I think there is luck if you kind of can get that immediately. But I think what Art Bank can do with our second part of our charter is help reveal some of those reasons why. So the reasons why an artist is doing something. And in doing that, I think that we can kind of maybe remove the element of luck and kind of replace it with, that idea of knowledge being power. And that I think that's I'd like to see it have a relationship on the inherent value within the work, but fundamentally, I don't think it's a measure of success. If it does, it's great, but if it doesn't, I think success can be measured in a variety of ways. And in terms of contemporary art, the commercial mechanism is only one side. So I think we need to look at success across the spectrum.
I just have one more question. It's more about the concept of the individual and the mirror that you were talking about before. I was just wondering if you think that, artists used to be commissioned as storytellers, like in a historical sense. And now, I guess, with social media and technology, people and the public are the storytellers. Do you think that threatens the position of modern artists?
No, I don't. I mean, it depends how you look at social media and social constructs and the mediated experience of lived life. I don't have a social media account. And it's not because I'm anti-technology. I love my Mac, I love my gadgets. But I really like talking to my friends. I mean, talking to them. I've started saying to my friends, because I get flack about it all the time. They're like, you're not old enough not to have a social media account. And it's true. My dad has one. He doesn't know how to use it, but he's got it. But, life is in 3D. It's that funny idea that, we're living life, so let's live it. Let's not mediate our experience and our relationships with the people around us, or the things around us, the world around us. And I don't think you can replace any of that experience with social media. You can connect to it in different ways. You can promote it. You can become aware of it. Your understanding is much broader because we have more information and we're connected to it much more quickly. And I think that can make you more savvy and informed on how you engage. And I think we see that now with consumers. They're much more savvy because they have more information. There's much more scope for them to research, to understand what they want. And I think this has had a corresponding shift on the role of marketing. And you see marketing campaigns which aren't marketing anymore, they're content. And what they're doing is they're layering value. And I like to look at social media as kind of the idea of Plato's cave, which is the simulacrum. It's this really old story, and in brief, it's been told many times. My favorite telling of the story is by Borges. He wrote a story called The Cartographers. And it was about a king that commissioned a group of map makers to make a map so accurate of his kingdom that he knew all nooks and crannies. So the map makers got to work. And they started creating this map, and it got bigger and bigger until the map was so accurate, it literally took up the entire country. So the borders of the map were the borders of the country. And people started living on the map, working on the map, sleeping on the map. But then the map was only paper, so it started to break down. And people felt dislocated from their lives because they could no longer relate to the country that they were living in because they'd mediated that experience through the map. And if anyone's interested, there's a really good movie called Synecdoche, New York, which is a more contemporary telling of that idea. And I think that's what social media ultimately is. It's a mediated life, a mediated experience. And I saw a thing on ABC, it was one of the Quarters programs or something, I can't remember exactly what it was, but they were talking about social media addiction. And they're like, to find out more, go to our Facebook page. And I thought, wow, that's an interesting commentary. Okay.
Ventures that you're involved in, so the Arts and Crafts Biennale, I think, and the gallery opening, you said they no longer exist. So what was it that gave them the momentum to a peak and then you think made them crash and burn?
Well, in terms of the longevity for those two creative ventures, I think one had been going for nearly 30 years. And I think the role of that organisation had changed over time, but also the needs of the sector had changed as well. So I think when it started, that first organisation, it was set up as a union for the first year, and it was about artist rights. And over the life of that organisation, I think many other kind of support mechanisms had sprung up, which kind of played a similar role. So the need for this centralised body became less and less until it kind of no longer was required. In terms of the commercial gallery that I worked for, well, you know, commercial galleries are complex beasts. I mean, I don't know anyone that can run retail on 40% markup. That's fundamentally what you do in a commercial gallery. And it had been going for 10 years, and the partners within the business had just decided that it was time to move on to different things. And that's kind of what happened. I mean, it's always sad to see something close, but you know, sometimes that closing allows for other things to happen. I think you can see different things that have popped up with the space that they created as well. So,
That's going to take us to time, so thanks.
Thank you.